Okay, maybe we could start. So good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where in the world you are. My name is Maxime Desmarais-Tremblay. I will be chairing the session because the first speaker, Joanna, I don't know if she was the first, but anyway, Joanna, who was supposed to chair the session, unfortunately cannot be with us today. So there will be only 2 presentations today. And so Agnes Simon, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So my presentation is Balogh and Kaldor, economic expertise, political involvement, and economists' public image. Introducing myself, I finished a PhD in history at Cambridge on Balogh and Kaldor and Labour Party economic policy making under the supervision of an economic historian, Martin Daunter, a number of years ago. And I picked up this research recently, hoping to share some of it and maybe publish it too. The research took me to the King's College archives in Cambridge, of course, where the Kaldor papers are held. And I just wanted to introduce the whole topic with this cartoon, which was apparently the only picture on the wall in his office. Kaldor following Keynes from King's College to Whitehall. Kaldor, of course, doesn't need introduction here, an important theoretician, both in the early part of his career in the continental Austrian tradition at the LSE, and as a Keynesian at Cambridge and the founding member of a post-Keynesian school. Balogh, on the other hand, not a theoretician, but a political economist interested in banking and trade, originally a city economist in the 30s, then at the Oxford Institute of Statistics during the war, and a fellow of Balliol after, a lecturer and reader in economics at Oxford. Both advised abroad and at home. And of course, this is what I would like to talk about here, the advising, since it seems that at the conference and other panels, not just our own, it seems that there is great interest in what power of economics might be over politics, There's interest in intervention in economic knowledge and in how economic experts function in government and economic policy making. So in the paper, I wanted to offer up an intriguing case of economists advising in and out of government, and that is the case of Balogh and Kaldor, Hungarian-born British economists appointed to government economic advisory roles in the 60s and 70s. Their story could be, of course, studied in the context of first the interwar history of intellectual and academic migration originating in Central and Eastern Europe, the emigre economists whose contributions were so vital to the then young discipline of economics. Then there is the post-war history of British economic policy making, the Keynesian revolution in economic policy, and specifically Labour Party economic policy in and out of office, and that was my PhD. Finally, there's a constitutional history of the rise of special advisors, or irregulars, as they were known at the time, that is political appointees serving individual ministers in the regular civil service, a very modern phenomenon of which Balogh and Kaldor were the very first representatives. The focus today will be on the appointments themselves. Balogh as special advisor to the cabinet, but really as Wilson's personal economic advisor, and Kaldor to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who was Jim Callan at first and then Lloyd Jenkins in October 1964 in Wilson's first Labour governments in office between 64 and 70. These appointments were headline news, with the two, according to one historian of British economics, acquiring a celebrity status not seen since Keynes' day. They inspired anything from anxious questions from conservative MPs in Parliament to cartoons, popular TV satire, and apparently even the Beatles song Taxman. These appointments were controversial then and interesting now, since they marked both the first influx of economists in large numbers into British government service after the war in the mid-60s, and also at the same time the beginning of a certain loss of credibility and influence of the economics profession in economic policy and ideology. Both economists were, of course, have been subjects of biographies, especially Kaldor, the important theoretician, but the statements that I just listed are reflected in the literature, both in produced by historians of 20th century, and especially post-war British economics. Great Bob Coates and Middleton, and I used his 1998 volume on British economics and economists. And the more recent sociological studies on economists in politics, economics in public reason, and economists as public intellectual, all working with the framework of contextualizing and historicizing interventionist economic knowledge and the activities and contributions of economists in the public sphere. So reading these, I found a few statements that could also introduce this topic. The first one is that the economists brought into government service in Britain for the first time in high numbers was apparently an important development in the professionalization of the discipline in Britain, but they were only numerically impressive at the time, had little influence overall, and especially not on the day-to-day running of the economy. Then there is the highly politicized nature of government economic advising that was detected, especially because of the appointment of Balogh and Kaldor, committed labor supporters, and Robert Neal, who was also the third academic economist at the same time appointed to a government advisory role. But in the end, the economists were just pawns in a political game. Ultimately, at the time of high Keynesianism, it seemed that economics also overpromised and underdelivered. So I would like to give a better definition to the Balogh and Kaldor episode in the context of early post-war history and sociology of British economics, with an emphasis on their strong professional, political, and public image, the two of them always inseparable, the terrible twins of post-war British economic policy making. And by enjoying a close proximity to leading politicians and decision makers of the time, forever outsiders, both as emigrant intellectuals and temporary political appointees in the regular civil service. I argue that their unusual celebrity or notoriety may have affected both their contemporary reception and modern day assessment, but also challenges the view that the British economics profession post-Keynes was both ineffectual and silent. As illustration, I included some cartoons that I also found in the Balogh papers, the Kaldor papers, that reflect on the Balogh-Kaldor phenomenon. In the rest of the talk, I want to reflect on their writings and policy work that led to their appointments and their activities and possible contributions as advisors. The first cartoons, of course, the Hungarian goulash at the Treasury, Hungarians go home, and too many foreign advisors, according to the last cartoon. So the first aspect of their lives, of course, that they were emigres, and they had very similar social and cultural background, and that is that they came from a Central European, urban, educated, and assimilated Jewish middle class. And there is inspiration to become an economist was famously the interval political and economic chaos as a result of war and the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Also, they attended the same elite secondary school or gymnasium. They then enrolled at Budapest University to study law, but only Balogh graduated. As many Hungarians in search of better educational and professional opportunities, they first moved to Germany and German universities, Berlin, Humboldt, more specifically in the case of Kaldor, while Balogh got an apprenticeship at the German Reichsbank. But both were in Britain by the end of the 20s. And the 1930s saw Kaldor start his career at the LSE as after a very successful undergraduate and a star pupil of Robins's and Hayek's. He graduated from there, and Balogh worked in the city in the 30s while occasionally lecturing at UCL. The earliest publications included studies on the economic and financial issues of the late 1920s, the systemic problems in international monetary affairs, and the economic reconstruction of the newly created small nation states in the Central European region on the ruins of the empire. While as Keynesian converts and in the run-up to war, they turned to war preparedness in Germany and Britain and the question of war finance. Balogh researched Germany's mobilization, and Kaldor worked famously on national income accounting for Keynes. At the same time, because of their foreign extraction, they were prevented from participating in official policymaking. It was, of course, the time when large numbers of the economics profession were drafted into the war economy, to run the war economy, and the new modes of economic management were put into practice to run a war. Instead, they were part of a circle of academics and intellectuals working outside Whitehall on an ambitious post-war domestic and international reconstruction. Kaldor's other well-known wartime contribution as an applied economist was his paper on the quantitative aspects of the full employment problem in Beveridge's second unofficial report, Full Employment in a Free Society. Balogh at the OIS, the Oxford Institute, at the time manned by famously emigre economists, worked on the international aspects of full employment. What they came up with was a radical Keynesian conception of economic management that incorporated the continued post-war use of wartime physical controls and economic planning measures to ensure the stability of a fully employed post-war economy. Full employment was not just the chief domestic policy aim, but was needed to ensure Britain's continuous standing in competition with emerging stronger economic powers. Balogh became, as a result, the epitome of the extreme left-wing economist and the noted critic of Bretton Woods and the emerging Anglo-American multilateral international monetary and trade agreement. Here's the next set of cartoons about them being from Eastern Europe and austerity measures being the steamroller of in British economic policy making behind Wilson and Callaghan. So Labour economists, they certainly belong to the Labour Party hinterland from fairly early on, but their activities within the party and their actual contributions to the party's economic thinking and policy has to be seen in the context of their personal friendships and professional connections with high-ranking Labour politicians. Even though both were members of and contributed memoranda to the Labour Party's national executive committees, policy committees, and study groups. Kaldor's first official position on the Royal Commission on Taxation and Profits in 1951 was in fact due to Hugh Gaitskell, another economist, politician, the last chancellor of the first post-war Labour government. His report to the Commission was going to be the basis of Labour's tax reform. Balogh's friendship with Wilson went back to their time together at the OIS and Oxford. He remained a close colleague and family friend of the Wilsons all throughout this period. At the same time in the 50s, though, while in opposition, they drifted to opposing ideological camps inside the party. Kaldor was on the revisionist right, Balogh was close to the left-wing Bevanite group, while Kaldor was on the revisionist right behind Gaitskell. While Balogh was against the market mechanism, Kaldor was concerned about fairness in taxation, equality, and distribution carried out via fiscal policy. But by the early 1960s, however, both worked on what is known as a Wilsonian left-of-center technocratic program, or in other places it was called Keynesian Plus, which is basically, instead of full employment by this stage, it was, of course, economic growth that was seen as the chief economic policy aim, with the worries about British competitiveness. The program included economic planning, enhanced investment, and technological innovation and fiscal reform. Kaldor's memorandum of dissent was part of this. Then Balogh produced Planning for Progress, a Fabian pamphlet, which served as the campaign material for the Labour Party for the 1964 election campaign. Even the idea of expert appointments into the civil service was a Baloghian idea, to advise government ministers independently from the civil service. Another set of cartoons, one of them is the referring to the fact of Kaldor advising abroad, and apparently the finance ministers having to wear an armor, and also Callaghan working with computer Balogh and computer Kaldor there. So finally, government advisors. As advisors, their appointment came early in the life of the new government. Because the whole special advisor experiment was poorly designed, the advisors' position and their effectiveness was complicated by and depended on their personal and working relationships with their advisees. It was still a very personal connection or working relationship. Their very appointments were the result of, again, long-standing friendships with the politicians they were supposed to advise. Balogh knew Wilson from Oxford, and the Kaldor appointment was expected as a result of an earlier pledge by Gateska, and after his early death by Wilson, the new Labour leader. Kaldor also advised Callahan just before the election. He was appointed, Kaldor, as special advisor part-time to the Chancellor of the Exchequer on the economic and social aspects of taxation policy. He switched to a full-time position in late 1965, but his enthusiasm waned after the resignation of Callahan following devaluation in November 1967. His working relationship with the Chancellor was initially very good, and Kaldor was set to enjoy working with the civil servants who he treated as his students at Cambridge. He sat in on committees and produced memoranda. Balogh titles and brief was, by contrast, not so clearly defined, causing much confusion. He was appointed economic advisor to the cabinet. Sources differ as to what his actual role was intended to be. According to media reports, he was brought in to advise on general economic matters, and specifically international liquidity. Alec Cairncross, never a fan of Balogh, and the head of the newly created Government Economic Service, noted in his diary that Balogh was going to advise on development policy. As a long-standing friend, he was Wilson's personal advisor, and contemporaries were aware of the special status Balogh enjoyed in Downing Street, although he was in constant battle with civil servants for access to politicians' papers and to be included in committees. Reference has been made earlier to the economic policy program Labour was hoping to put into practice, aimed at modernization and growth promotion. Policymaking in government is really involves day-to-day running of the economy and having to respond to various challenges and making difficult trade-offs. The first of which was that in a fixed exchange-based system, a drive for growth can cause balance of payments problems. Basically, the Balogh and Kaldor activities that I found and traced was all concerning fiscal measures. One example recommended in the very first memo that Balogh sent to the Prime Minister, he recommended Kaldor to work out a new tax rooted in Kaldor's growth laws based on his belief in a connection between fiscal policy and export promotion. This was the selective employment tax, a payroll tax paid in the service sector and used to keep costs down in manufacturing. Of course, the other pieces of legislation was the capital gains tax and corporation tax that was introduced as a result of Kaldor's work in 1966. On the other hand, close to Balogh's heart was, of course, indicative planning, French styles, and institutional innovation concerning economic policy making in government, but I could not find any trace of any of his activity or any work during his time in government about setting up the Department of Economic Affairs, which was tasked to draw up a new national plan, a new department in opposition to the Treasury. Finally, of course, all of them were concerned and interested in exchange rate policy and devaluation, the question of devaluation, which was famously a decision made by the politicians without the economic experts and economic advisors on the very first night of the government in power. Devaluation was only brought in 1967. By this stage, both of these economists had diminished influence in policy circles. Even though Kaldor was famously, from the very first moment, pressing for devaluation and floating of the pound, as can be seen in one of his memoranda, fixed or flexible rates. Finally, a recent find. This is already jumped to the 1980s. Following April 1981, the famous letter by the 364 British economists to open letter criticizing the new conservative governments, Thatcher governments policies, and many of us are, as I've just quoted from here, many of us are eager to end the tyranny of freedmen and bring back the golden days of Balogh and Kaldor. Our slogan for Britain is Americans out, Hungarians in. So that's the rise of course, monetarist ideology and influence in policy circles after 1979. Just briefly concluding, so that was really at the end of an era, the Balogh and Kaldor era, as reflected in the last cartoon. The questions that I wanted to kind of discuss or interesting is their status in not just actual policy circles, but of course in public life in general, their outsider status and how that actually affected their insider activities. They were the poster boys of the 60s, high Keynesianism and the special advisory experiment. Obviously a very strong public image, but of the public figures eager to address those in power and not the economic theorist. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Agnes. This was really interesting. If the room agrees, I could go on with my presentation and then we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. So let me turn this. Okay. Right, so that should be all right. So you can see this. Okay, so as the proverb goes, in the world, nothing is certain except debt and taxes. While utterly technical, tax reforms are also political, and they can lead to mass protests like they did last spring in Colombia, in which sadly many people were killed. Public finance has always been part of economic discourses since at least the rise of political economy in the 17th century. And yet there's not much work on the history of economic thought dealing with taxation, especially in the 20th century and in the second part of the 20th century on taxation. There's one good book on the history of the Karl Schoup mission, but that's about it in terms of 20th century tax reform. One way to approach this this theme is to ask the question: how do economists influence policy, or to what extent economists influence policy? It's I think a question that interests many of us in history of economic thought, but that is very hard to tackle. And I was first struck by how the answer to that question coming from the economists themselves, or coming from economic theory. And in the 20th century, the sort of dominant view is the one that economists are neutral advisors, that they are the clients of the politician. And this is well captured by the idea of the social welfare function that should capture all the priorities, goal, target, values of the politicians, and then the economist is only the client of the politician. And so in that respect, the actual role of the economist is that of a purely technician serving really the values and the objectives of the politicians. In a way, at the other end of the spectrum, in terms of influence, we find John Maynard Keynes' idea in the general theory that politicians are only the slaves of some defunct economists merely projecting ideas of some academic scribbler of a few years back. And in a way, both, I think these answers are quite unsatisfactory in terms of explaining what's going on. And sociologists have, I think, a better grasp of how economists do influence policy, but when they do, it's mostly indirect, filtered through institutions. And what I want to argue in this paper is that this influence, when it comes to tax reform especially, this influence depends on the capacity of the economists to convince others and build a consensus around their proposals. And so going back to Maynard's father, I want to argue that tax reform is an art. And so it combines positive knowledge and normative principles, but is also shaped by more generally a worldview that the economist holds and that is shared with other economists of their generation. So I've drafted the paper, and it's quite unsatisfactory at this stage, so I'm trying to redraft it in a chronological fashion. So hopefully the outline I will get at is the chronological one, starting with Musgrave in the 1950s, and then spending most of the paper on analyzing his advice in the 1960s. I will get to that. So a convenient starting point to for my story is in a way one of the important speech of the beginning of the Cold War by Truman in his inaugural address. He committed in 1949 to the United States to fight the false philosophy of communism that stood in opposition to American democracy. And he promised technical capital investment in these underdeveloped areas, and that the United States would provide technical knowledge to help them and to prevent them from falling under the influence of the USSR. So this is very well known, and it's taken to be one of a convenient starting point for the history of development economics. But it's also important for my story about Musgrave and tax reform. Because a few months later, the New York Times reported that the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, known as the World Bank, would send a 9-man mission to Colombia, investigating ways to increase the wealth of the country. And the mission would be headed by Lachlan Curry, who was a famous New Dealer. And it ended up being the largest survey mission of the World Bank so far, with 14 foreign advisors and 14 foreign experts and many local advisors as well, spending 4 months on the field. So a major project of the World Bank in Colombia. It was not the beginning of, obviously, American economists advising in Colombia. Both countries had enjoyed close economic ties, at least since the 1920s. Unfortunately, we couldn't hear Joanna today, but I think her paper would have dealt with Edwin Kemmerer, probably the most famous of these interwar money doctors, who went to Colombia for his first South American mission in 1923, and then later in 1930. And Robert Triffin also conducted at least a mission in the 1940s in Colombia. So Colombia has been the focus of a lot of attention of American expertise starting in the 1920s. And to me, it's not very clear in terms of rupture between the money doctoring mission and the tax reform mission that Musgrave and then others would do in the 1970s and 80s. I think there is some continuity, and if you have some insights about this, I'd be very interesting to hear. But clearly, with the Curie mission, that was not mostly a tax expertise mission, it had a much broader scope than the more narrow financial mission of the interwar in 1940s. So there is, in a sense, a break here that happens with Curie and a goal that is much broader. And in a sense, the other post-war mission, most of them will continue with this much broader scope. So this New York Times article from '49 also mentioned that Richard Musgrave, a professor at the University of Michigan, would be the chief economist of the Curie mission. So who was Musgrave? He was also an immigrant intellectual. He was born in Germany and studied in Munich, Heidelberg before moving to the United States. And he received his PhD from Harvard in 1937 in public finance, and then spent the war years at the Federal Reserve. And so moving from public finance to monetary policy, he acquired practical experience in that field, but always wanted to go back to academia. So he got a job at the University of Michigan in 48. And so that's the point at which he is called to lead the sort of economic part of the mission in Colombia. So over the years, Musgrave will provide some advice, write small memos, memorandum, either through consulting agencies or directly called by local government in a range of countries, as you can see here. Unfortunately, one of the challenge of this work for me is that he didn't keep many archival material or many of his papers of these missions. So we have a few pictures like this one, where this is the latest large mission that he conducted in Bolivia in 1976. But other than that, there's not much correspondence, and he didn't reflect that much upon his experience in developing countries or as a traveling economist, unfortunately. So going back to the Curie mission, we don't know very much about Musgrave's involvement there. This picture is from Michele Alasevic's book on the history of that mission, and Musgrave doesn't appear more than in 2 or 3 footnotes in the whole book, but there he is in this picture. Curie is in the middle on the bottom row, and Musgrave is third from the left on the top row. So what are the general thrust of the report is to push, to make a sort of push to overcome underdevelopment vicious circles. This is really Curie's idea of development that he builds through the report. There's not a reliance on an explicit theory of growth at the time. But the idea is the recommendation go in the direction of stabilizing exchange rate, creating economies of scale, building transport infrastructure, increasing public expenditures and sanitation, health, education, housing, supporting administrative reforms, and favoring urbanization, and also increasing agricultural productivity. These are the goals of the report, a 700-page report. And so Musgrave is in charge of the chapters on money and banking and on fiscal policy. The way the report is structured is that there's a part where it's more like a positive analysis, and then there's a second part which is a normative recommendation. So for both money and banking and fiscal policy, there's one sort of positive analysis chapter and then one normative recommendation chapter that were drafted by Musgrave. This is noted in the report, and this I could confirm from what I saw in the Curie papers at Duke. I'm still waiting for people at the World Bank to give me access to some of these files. I've been waiting for months, and somehow they haven't given me access yet. So it's not, again, this is not a tax reform, but I think it's important because this is the first work that Musgrave would do in terms of recommending for a certain tax policy change in Colombia. So here it has to do with better budgeting, the presentation of the public accounts, also in the continuity of these tax money doctoring, mission. It has to do with monetary stability, increasing the flow of foreign exchange, and so on. When it comes to taxation, there are some general recommendations in terms of tax administration. And we see already Musgrave's lifelong commitment to the income tax as, in a way, the best instrument, especially for more developed countries. So, and it has to be not only a tax for the rich, as it used to be, for instance, in the United States before the Second World War, but a tax that permits, as I'm quoting here, a more equitable distribution of the tax burden over the middle and lower income brackets. And as countries get richer, this tax will be of increasing importance as the expenses of the government increase and the share of the public sector and the economy increases as well. This being said, Musgrave recommends increasing revenues from luxury goods. There are multiple advantages to taxing luxury goods. For instance, if we tax excess, it could channel foreign reserve into more productive investment. And it also taxing local luxury good increases savings, and this saving is very important to increase investment to get a faster growth. But also taxing luxury good is a good way to reduce inequalities. So excise and custom duties are very much important tools for lower developed or least developed countries. So after the report is published, there's a committee on economic development that was established by Curry by the Colombian government, and Curry served as an economic advisor, and they contracted Musgrave as one of the consultants. So I found a memo on this in the archive, and there Musgrave recommends improvement in tax administration. And some of these recommendations were taken on board in the final report of the committee that also created the National Planning Council in Colombia. Then what happened is that the World Bank, although they were not officially involved in that stage, they pushed for the candidacy of Albert Hirschman to be the main economic advisor of this new planning council. And they still retained the services of Curry, and so they're both advising the same body at the same time, and the clash between the two men led to complicated relationship, let's put it this way, and this has been dealt with in the literature, these opposition between Curry and Hirschman in 1952, 1953 mostly. So now I'm skipping a few years, moving forward. In the 1960s, when actually as soon as Kennedy is elected, he makes it one of his priorities to counteract the influence of communism in Latin America, especially after Castro took over Cuba since 1959. And so the Organization of American States established a set of principles that will, and in an important conference in 1961 in Punta del Este, the American states signed the Charter of the Alliance for Progress that was proposed by Kennedy. And in this charter, we find some of the targets that will then be reflected in terms of priorities for tax reform in Latin America throughout the 1960s. So a per capita growth rate of no less than 2.5%, a more equitable distribution of national income, favoring price stability, raising agricultural productivity and output, implementing agrarian reforms, eliminating adult illiteracy and increasing life expectancy, supporting democratic institutions. And the Latin American countries will have to write development plans. They will receive help from CEPAL to do so. Colombia adopts its development plan in 1961. And the US, and one of the counterpart is that the US will provide financial and technical assistance to Latin American countries, specifically to finance tax reform projects. So over the decade, there's a growing fiscal expertise on Latin America. In the United States, Musgrave, among others, participates in a first important conference in 1961. And then there's an important survey mission by Milton Taylor, who goes to Colombia in 1964. And Taylor was a graduate of the University of Wisconsin under Goods. And Richard Byrd, who was a student of Carl Schoup in Colombia, also spent some time in Colombia here, the University of Columbia, also spent some time in Colombia, the country. in 1965, Musgrave is hired at Harvard, and it's important that he has a joint appointment with the law school. In the law school, there was the international tax program, and Musgrave gets involved in this program that teaches civil servants from across the world in fiscal matters. And so Musgrave and Oldman together, Oldman, who was a tax lawyer in the Harvard Law School, they start to teach on tax reform in developing countries in already 1967 in the law school. Meanwhile, Musgrave is also writing a study of a comparative political economy of fiscal systems that sort of summarizes some of this rising literature on taxation in developing countries, and also just generally sort of comparative political systems. And we find there some of the ideas that were already in 1950, but it's sometimes has a sort of more clear edge. He says there are somehow different stages of development, and each with its own challenges in terms of fiscal matters, and each with its own tax handles. And so tax policy in particular is limited by the capacity to tap income expenditure flows. And he also puts it very clearly that there's a trade-off between redistribution and growth, because developing countries have a very small public income. They need to channel as much as possible in terms of productive investment in order to grow. And so it leaves a little room for direct redistribution. And so this is why commodity taxes is still an important tool for least developed countries. So where I'm getting at here is that before Musgrave is called for by the president of Colombia in 1968, he has developed all this positive knowledge about tax incidents in general, but specifically in developing countries, as well as having a general idea of the tax instruments that are applicable in developing countries. And this is all in a way also influenced by his general worldview that he wants to, help poor countries grow and increase the welfare of the population, and that the public sector is an important agent in this progressive transformation. So in April 1968, in fact, just a day before Martin Luther King is killed in Memphis, Musgraves arrives, lands in Bogota. He's been invited directly by the president. So this mission is not channeled through the Association of American States like Taylor mission was. It's directly Musgrave who arrives in Colombia, called by the president to chair a tax mission to modernize the tax system. There's unfortunately no evidence in his archives besides these nice picture of him in the press, in the Colombian press in April '68. And we see Musgrave here on the right, and the Minister of Finance in the middle, and Miguel Urrutia on the left. And I'm hoping I can interview Urrutia, who was a very young assistant to the minister at the time and is still a professor at the University of Los Andes in Colombia. And so I don't know yet what were the actual motivations of the president to call this tax reform mission. What was I think novel feature of that mission in '68 is that the president asked for the mission to have a parity between foreign economists and local economists. So there were 4 foreign experts and 4 Colombian experts, and includes a very large staff of technical staff, some of which will become later on chiefs of mission reform in Colombia and elsewhere, like Richard Byrd and Charles McClure. They were junior economists at the time. As I said, McClure had just finished his PhD with Musgrave at Princeton in 1963 or 64, I think. And so what was interesting is that they voted on the recommendation. So they had these discussion together, some proposal were put forward, and then on every recommendation, there was a vote. And because there was a parity between local experts and foreign experts, it meant that at least, some Colombian expert had to support the proposals for them to have a majority support and find their way in the report. So I very much, although the Colombian development plan was 8 years old by then, some of the general thrust of the recommendation follow the Alliance for Progress goals of the so-called development decade. So Musgrave pushes here for increased revenue, increases between 15 and 22% of public revenues. And that would hopefully allow the Colombian economy to grow at least 2.5% per capita, which was quite tremendous because at the time, the population is growing at more than 3% a year. So we're talking about real GDP growth of 5%, which in fact Colombia didn't really achieve in the coming years, but still that was the target. And so we see again the progressive orientation. The tax reform should contribute to securing a more equitable distribution of income and wealth. They push for heavier reliance upon luxury taxation. And there are some measures to extend the income tax to the so-called hard-to-tax groups. And here we mean especially agriculture. Colombia, the agricultural sector is still the largest sector in Colombia at the time. And most of this sector avoids the income tax. And so they propose to have a presumptive tax. So the idea would be that we assume that agricultural land yields a revenue of 10% a year, and we include that equivalent amount in the base of the income tax. Musgrave was not the first. In fact, the Taylor Mission had proposed that presumptive tax, but somehow the Musgrave report became in Colombia famous for that proposal of a presumptive tax that Musgrave will also suggest for Bolivia, for instance, years later, but not much of that was implemented in Bolivia. So let me turn now to, so I don't have time, there was 130 recommendations. Let me turn to how Musgrave, I think, mobilizes the normative and the positive to articulate the recommendation and convince fellow members of the commission and eventually other technocrats in Colombia, but most importantly, politicians and members of the civil society, that these proposals are sound and appropriate for the Colombian economy. And so here, by emphasizing the role of normative principles in tax reform, which is in this case not much a matter of the engineering side or of the administration, but very much putting forward a new proposal for changing the structure. And so I thought maybe the economist should be compared to the architect. Rather than the doctor, Kemmerer himself made the analogy that tax advisors were doctors called in administer medicine to an acute crisis. And then we have, Keynes, who argued economists should be compared to dentists. Estelle Duflo says they're better thought of as plumbers. But I think the analogy with the architect, when it comes to especially this period of structuralist thinking in the 1960s. So in fact, Musgrave himself, when he comments on the tax reform project in Canada, makes a comparison between the report and a beautiful cathedral. And so what I want to argue is that when it comes to Musgrave's normative vision of tax equity, we have these pillars of horizontal equity and vertical equity. The idea of having tax or normative principles in taxation is not new. In fact, it goes back a long way, from probably to natural law in the 17th century. And most famously, Adam Smith articulated some maxims of taxation. And in the 1950s, Musgrave sort of re-articulate these concerns that have been passed on from generation to generation in tax equity, with the idea of horizontal equity and vertical equity. I'm pretty sure he coined these concepts himself. And so they are important in the Colombian report, as they will be used as well in other tax reform projects, especially in the 60s and 70s in Canada, in the UK, and then also in the US in the 1986 reform. And so here, the idea, for those who are not familiar, horizontal equity is the idea that equals should be treated equally when it comes to tax purpose, and vertical equity is the idea that in a way unequals should be treated unequally. And obviously that doesn't specify exactly how unequally, whether it should be proportional or progressive. That's a matter for debate, and I can come back to that in the discussion if you're interested. The point here is that horizontal and vertical equity are formal concepts that help to structure the discussion of tax reform by providing a language to express normative judgments on alternative tax proposals. And it's important, and as Musgrave reflected on his Columbia experience in 1979, he said, pragmatism alone will not be a sufficient guide for tax reform. We need some guidance. We need some clear principle. Now, that was for the main sort of pillars of the normative side. When it comes to positive analysis, obviously, there are many aspects of knowledge of the Colombian economy that was built by the large team of staff working with civil servants in Colombia, developing, improving national accounts, for instance. And here I want to put attention to two tables that I think help here construct devices. They are in a way devices that help the economist to convey his message and to convince others. And so here I like very much this idea from Ted Porter, who argued in his 1995 book that quantification is a technology of distance that helps communication beyond the boundaries of localities and community. And here, in a way, when there's a foreign American expert and a local economist and politicians as well, there obviously the cultural distance is very real. And so these tables that are in fact sort of quantified deductions, they constitute a sort of objective knowledge that people can trust, and that on which they can probably agree as a picture of the Colombian economy. So one, for instance, here on the left-hand side is the effective tax rate by income brackets. This was calculated here by Charlie McClure for the Colombian report, I think based on a method that Musgrave developed at the University of Michigan with his graduate students in the late 1940s. And so what we see from this table here, and I bring your attention to the right, the last column here, is that as they say in the report, the tax structure is roughly proportional. And so in legal terms, we have a tax structure that is progressive, but when we make the incidence analysis, we see that the tax structure is actually not that progressive. And in fact, in the middle range of the tax bracket, we see that it's slightly regressive as well. So this, again, this table, I think, conveys the idea that the tax system is not that progressive, and therefore perhaps more can be done in terms of taxing the rich if we want to help the poor. on the right-hand side is a simpler table here of the ratio of tax revenue to gross national product. And here the point is that Colombia's tax effort, which just the idea of tax effort, I think is an interesting concept, because others would speak of tax burden, and obviously tax effort conveys a much more positive image. And so the collective effort of Colombians here is among the lowest in comparable countries. So, right, the point is not to compare to the US, but even among Latin American countries, Colombia has among the lowest GDP, tax revenue to GDP. And so again, this conveys the idea that since the fiscal burden is relatively low by international standard, there is room to increase the tax effort, to increase tax rates, and to enlarge the base. That in certain cases, enlarging the base will mean more taxes for the rich, because they benefited at the time from many sorts of exemptions. So the report was submitted to the president in 1969. What happened after is that some of the more technical, least debated recommendations were implemented already in 1969. But since the price of coffee increased dramatically, and at the time 2/3 of Colombians' export were coffee, that brought in lots of revenues and reduced the need for new sources of public revenue. So, and meanwhile, there was also a national election in 1970, and the conservative government was elected. This wasn't a surprise, because at the time, Colombia was in a national coalition government between the conservatives and the liberal. And so they alternated basically every 4 years. And so it was sort of expected that the conservatives would take power in 1970, which they did. And so in a way, they shelved the report. But meanwhile, in the 1970s, in the first half of the 70s, the fiscal deficit increased. There was high level of inflation. And so in the next election in 1974, the liberal candidate, Alfonso López Michelson, was elected on a platform to fight inflation and redistribute income. And there I found it very interesting that in his inaugural speech, he argued exactly in the terms of the Musgrave report. He says we have one of the lowest indices in the world in terms of fiscal participation, barely 8.5%. So in a way, at least that message was well understood. And so he declared a state of economic emergency. He had a very broad political support for the election. And so at the beginning, there wasn't much political position in him taking these emergency powers that basically blocked the Congress. And so the Congress didn't have to debate the details of the tax law. And so what he did even before taking power was to assemble a group of young technocrats, and some of whom had worked, especially Miguel Urrutia, who was the secretary of the commission. He was in this group of young Colombian technocrats, and they drafted a very ambitious tax reform proposal that was then passed in 1974, and that included some proposal recommendations that were very inspired by the Musgrave report. So to conclude, economists are contracted by politicians or institutions, but they also come with their worldview, with normative principles, and with positive knowledge that shape the answer they provide. When looking at looking at all this material on tax reform, one thing that struck me is how little originality there was, and how, in a way, some recommendations that were made, even in the 1920s are still the same recommendations about base broadening that you see up until the 1980s. They don't always have the same stress, and what kind of exemption should be canceled is not always the same, but some of these recommendations are very similar across decades. And so, in a way, what's striking is not the originality or the brilliance here of the recommendation. I think, in a way, what constitutes a mark of success for tax reform proposal is obviously the possibility to forge a consensus, as well as here one reason why, or at least according to commentators, one reason why some of the proposals of the Musgrave report found their way into the tax reform in 1974 was because there were local actors who were very implicated in the process, and that is probably newer compared to earlier tax missions that were conducted by, let's say, American advisors who just came in the country with their own foreign staff and then made recommendation and then left straight away. But also by saying that originality is not what matters so much, obviously, I don't want to deny the fact that through this expertise, economists build social capital, obviously, but it doesn't bring them sort of scientific merit, I think, to spend all this time studying the nitty-gritty of fiscal matters in all countries and writing countless recommendations. So it somehow matters as a general aura for their career, but it's not what is going to give them academic awards or a Nobel Prize, for instance. One thing I noted as well is that there's a tension between democracy and technocratic governance, I think. Here, Musgrave certainly accepted, I think, this tension because he was both committed to democracy and he also believed that some technical problems were better addressed by experts. And in a democratic setting, the report is owned by the people and their representatives. And so, again, the brilliance or the coherence of the text cannot compensate for a lack of political support for the recommendation. And even if this is a sad state of things from the economist's point of view, this is something that one must accept if one is commits to democratic principle. And even if the recommendations are implemented, tax reform is a never-ending process because of the economic, political, and cultural situation does change and calls for constantly renewing and having new waves of tax reform. Thank you very much. Sorry if I took a bit too much time. Right, so now for those who joined recently, Joanna cannot be with us, and so there was only 2 presentations in this session, and now we have plenty of time for discussions. So please, the floor is open. Anyone wants to comment on any of the 2 presentations? Perhaps you can raise your hand virtually or type something in the chat box if you want to ask a question or make a comment. Anyone wants to jump in? Marianne, yes. Good.
Sorry, I was trying to raise my hand and I forgot where it was. I was intrigued by the comment you had about the trade-off between growth and distribution, because that seems to be something that's been implicitly assumed, right, in most classical and neoclassical economic theory. But Gunnar Myrdal takes completely the opposite view at about the same point in time. Right? And so the Swedish position was that he argued that you couldn't have growth without a better distribution of income. And
sorry, can you repeat that? I missed part of the sentence.
Sorry, that you can't have economic growth without a better distribution of income, that the better distribution of income will push economic growth. And I'm just curious by why he's such an outlier, I think, in like the public finance literature. I have no idea. It struck me that it was, that everyone always thinks this, but you know.
It's a good question. I wouldn't know in what he was referring, because in this case of the trade-off, I think Musgrave here, at least in the 1968 book, is very clear that this applies specifically to least developed countries or developing countries because of the paucity of savings. And so the public revenues are very scarce. And so we have to, invest as much as possible into productive channels. And so that means that we can't use too much public revenue for redistribution and I think this is where he would say that in the case of the US, so in the 1950s in the US, there's this debate about tax reform in the late 50s. And then when Kennedy comes to power, some people are pushing for tax reform and the tax cut to boost the economy. And in the end, the tax cut is implemented under Johnson without the tax reform. But anyhow, when Musgrave is among those who favored the tax reform, and at the time in this paper, I think it's in 62, he says, in the case of the US, we don't need to compromise equity and growth. So it seems to be a fiscal base that's large enough for us to do better with the public revenues we had in terms of improving investment in productive channels without sacrificing equity. So that he's very clear about the case of the US. But in the case of Colombia and other developing countries, there he says that there's just not enough, of public revenues to do both, or it's rather the fact that if we want to help the very, very poor in Colombia, and there's many of them, then we'd better grow the economy. That's the best way we can help them. So that's how I understand this. Yeah. So I don't know, Myrdal, if he was speaking obviously in a different context. Other questions, comments? Maybe you can think of your questions. Agnes, I found a letter in Wolfgang Stolper archive at Duke. Stolper was also an intellectual immigrant in the US from I think Austria, where he was born, and or Germany, but he studied in Austria, something like that. Anyway, he also advised developing countries, and in the 1980, he's asked to make recommendation for the first, 1968, he's asked to make recommendation for the first Nobel Prize, and so Nobel Prize in economics, and he puts up this very interesting letter, and he names who he thinks are the most important economists deserving the Nobel Prize in different countries. And so because he has this international outlook, he goes in a way by country. And when it comes to England, and it's early in his letter, he says, well, John Hicks of Oxford, Hicks is the best known economist, and his practical advice in Ceylon, in Nigeria, in other countries has been of immense value, something that cannot be said in other famous British economists, such as Nicholas Kaldor, whose advice had been catastrophic and whose theoretical contribution are more in the nature of gimmicks. So I don't know if you've had a bit of time to study. I assume here that he talks about Kaldor's mission in India, I believe. How does that relate to your story, perhaps?
Well, I mean, I have to say that, yes, foreign advising, I haven't looked into that, but I remembered India. The case there was, and this goes back to his basically, and again, I tend to say this, I'm not an economist. So basically, what he was talking about earlier on was a expenditure tax, so that you get taxed on your spending. And I think he actually managed to introduce some form of that in India. And that was controversial. So I think that was one of the reasons why he and both actually Balogh, the gimmick meister, was, I've heard and read regularly about them as, because of their suggestions of various fiscal tax and tools to manipulate the economy.
Interesting. Yeah, I haven't looked carefully at Kaldor's proposal, but I think whenever Musgrave is talking about, in general terms, about tax reform, there's always a little paragraph about consumption tax, and there's always Kaldor as the reference point.
Yes,
And
yes.
and I think Musgrave has always been dismissive as well, not sort of that kind of comment about Kaldor, but saying, okay, we see in theory the merits of an expenditure tax, but it's not going to work in practice, and in the transition, we might lose tax revenues, and so we better stick to the income tax. And I referred to these horizontal and vertical equity concepts, the idea that in horizontal equity that equals should be treated equally, then obviously that begs the question of equals according to which, and then you have to decide on the fiscal basis, and the debate among economists is whether income should be the basis or expenditure. And so I think Kaldor seems to have been the first to propose this idea of well, in fact, no, it goes back to Thomas Hobbes in a way that said people should be taxed according to their expenditures, consumption rather. But then Kaldor is taken as the representative of that view that Musgrave sort of criticized throughout his life. And I think it has a sort of second life when in the 1980s, there's more debates among economists about taxing expenditures or consumption rather than income. People like Charles McClure put forward more proposals, sort of resuscitate this idea of Kaldor of an expenditure tax. But again, I haven't studied that either to see to what extent they really depended on Kaldor's idea when they put these forward in the 80s. Mary, you have a question?
Well, I feel a bit guilty having a question because I only managed to make the last 10 minutes of your talk, Maxime, and I entirely missed Agnes, and I was really struck that I hope I didn't miss Agnes talking about the famous Kaldor riots, and which I've never known exactly what happened, but my friends who work on Africa, every time I mention Stolper, they say, the Kaldor riots. So I hope I didn't miss it. Anyway, you're talking about Stolper kind of raised something for me because I've done some work on his work in Nigeria. And I'm wondering something you finished up with about the tension between the democratic and the technocratic, and between the local and the experts who are sworn in. And I just came earlier from a session on Tinbergen, where this is a really relevant point about the nature of the engagement of the external experts in the local economy and the extent to which they understand the local economy and the extent to which that matters in the success of overcoming the democratic technocratic kind of tension or gap. And so I'm wondering something a little bit extreme here, but whether there's some kind of an impossibility theorem here that one could think about across cases as to what makes an external expert create an impossible situation, or they're never going to be successful because of this combination. When I taught American history, I used to be very enamored of an impossibility theorem from Stefan Fennelter about, I can't remember exactly, but the impossibility of having free land, free ownership of land, and slave labor. That you cannot have an institutional setup which has these three things. So I'm wondering if there's some kind of equivalent way of thinking about the cases that we're all generating really interesting things about the way experts work and when they work successfully and when they don't. So going back to the example of Stolper, Stolper was there for nearly 3 years. And he worked alongside in his own office, he had lots of local economists. And he had spent a lot of time going around the country, and also all of his planning mechanisms required the local democratic process to feed in what they wanted to do. So it was a very locally based, locally driven planning set of priorities. And I think in some sense it could have been relatively successful, but I think it would be nice to have a way of comparing all these different kinds of experts who come in, do something, go, and most of them are often coming in for a week and going, as opposed to staying for 2 or 3 years. So So I was just sort of proposing some way of thinking about this across the cases as opposed to individually. Maybe this is not helpful though.
No, I think I think it would be helpful. I've only one case study, so I can't build out of a too strong typology out of my one case study. But I think what I've seen is that discussions along these lines are filtered through the creative vocabulary of Hirschman, and I think Hirschman is very insightful, but he has his own way of seeing the world and sort of creating new concepts that then get picked up in some of that history of development economics literature that in a way I think is a quite strong filter that sort of you have to take side with Hirschman, because if you use his language that sort of leads you in that direction. So I'm not sure I want to go in that direction, but or whether there will be an impossibility theorem, but I think this tension is still there, and I don't know exactly how to frame it. I haven't studied enough cases to do that, but I think it would be useful. Yeah. I don't know, Agnes, do you want to say something about this, or we can't hear you? But okay, Bob.
Yeah, just want to make a comment about how Musgrave would have reacted to Kaldor's expenditure taxation proposal. When you mentioned people back to Thomas Hobbes, who talked about taxing consumption rather than income, but for Musgrave, I would think that the advocate of expenditure taxation who would come to his mind would be Irving Fisher. Because Fisher's book on constructive income taxation and a series of articles, like a 55-page article in Econometrica, arguing for expenditure taxation on double taxation grounds, that because savings were used to buy assets whose market value was the present value of the after-tax income, and one of Musgrave's early publications that was, I think, important in his career was an AR reply to Fisher on that subject around of expenditure taxation around 1940. So that would have been before Kaldor took up expenditure taxation. So I think that because of that, the role of that exchange in Musgrave's early career, when he would have encountered Kaldor on expenditure taxation, he would have just thought of this as a rerun of Fisher.
Yes, I think this is a good point, and again shows that I haven't looked enough carefully at this taxation of consumption. So yes, thank you for reminding me of that. I forgot about Fisher. And so you're right that if I remember correctly, Musgrave's argument against this idea of double taxation relies on going back to Haig and Simon's definition of income, right? And if we strictly interpret their definition of income as accretion, then this problem of double taxation is sort of dissolves conceptually. So that's, I think, it was one of the main reasons for the consumption base that he would disagree with, that makes a comeback as well in the 80s. But somehow it must be that Kaldor's proposal is sort of, I don't know, more extensive in terms of application. I don't know exactly, but I'm pretty sure that from the 1970s onward, when he does refer to consumption as the general basis for taxation, he does refer to Kaldor, but you're right, it doesn't reflect his intellectual genealogy correctly. Thank you. Other comments, questions, criticism? Yes, Javier.
Yeah, thanks so much for both papers. Really interesting. I have a question for you, Maxime. I happen to read quickly among the recommendations of for the tax reform in Colombia, there was the income tax, and I wanted to ask you if Musgrave was contemplating any sort of progressivity and graduated income tax, I mean, and if so, if he specified what kind of graduation, very high graduation or not so much, just for the sake of knowing it.
Yeah, so again, and I would have to go back to be 100% sure of the detail, but what I remember is that in fact Colombia is one of the first countries in the world to have an income tax, and goes back to, you know, independence in, I don't know, 1821, but it's not effectual for many years. And somehow, because I haven't looked at these earlier details, but it becomes a serious thing that brings in. So at first, I think it's just because it's legally canceled and then it's not applicable, then comes back in the early 20th century, but it really doesn't bring much public revenue. Most of the revenue come from customs and excise, really. And following the second Kemmerer visit in 1930, there's a tax reform in 1935, and then from 1935, the income tax is an important part of the Colombian fiscal structure. It's not the most important source of revenue. Again, excise and duties are still more important, but there is a progressive income tax in 1935. And in 1950, in the Courier report, Musgrave says, yes, this is a good thing. And in fact, it's complicated because there's 3 sets of income tax. And so one is an income tax, but again, the base is not as widespread as we would think. Another one is there's a net wealth tax, and there's an I think there's a third part I forget, but there's like three kinds of income tax, and it's quite a messy system, but there at least 2 of these have some a graduation of some form. The proposal at the time is to simplify them, to have a general income tax rather than these specific graduated tax. But the thrust in 68 is still not to increase the progressivity much, because again, of the argument I was saying that there's the tax handles are not very strong, and so to get the income of the rich, and Colombia is a very unequal society, we should rather try to tax those that are not included, like in the agricultural sector, and also cancel some exemptions that benefit mostly the rich, and also tax their luxury consumption. And here, luxury is not defined in sort of value judgment term, but only in terms of which goods are consumed by people whose income is, let's say, above the medium income. So things like cars are considered as luxury goods, and it's easy to tax either those that are imported or those that are produced locally. And so, and in fact, in the 1974 reform, they established a very progressive consumption tax, with these tax rates varying from some goods are taxed at 0 to other goods taxed at 35%, really luxury things. So there's more progressivity, in fact, in the 74 reform, more progressivity in the consumption tax, at least from a legal basis. So the income tax is always there, I think, for Musgrave as the sort of horizon of modernity, in the sense that as countries get richer, we can increase their reliance on this. And he's at the same time, fighting battles in the US in order to maintain the centrality of the income tax in the US tax system. So it's very clear that for him and other economists of his generation, I think the income tax is still the best tax instrument for modern fiscal states. So he doesn't want to cancel it in Colombia, but he doesn't say that it should do a much bigger role in terms of getting tax revenue. It can just be reducing horizontal inequities. This is more the thrust of rather than increasing vertical equity, it's more of enlarging the base, canceling exemptions, making the rates simpler, because there were dozens of different rates, and having a simpler rate structure so that it's more transparent. And this, he says, is also a way to support democratic institutions, because if you have a more clear and simple fiscal system, people will trust the state more, and it will be more transparent, and their trust in government will increase. And so it's part of this institution building. Right, I've talked too much. Is there any last question or comment? Otherwise, thank you all very much for coming this morning or afternoon. And I believe we have a session later on diversity, right? Well, thanks again, and see you. Bye.